There is a photograph that almost no one talks about. It was taken sometime in the late 1960s, somewhere between one of Elizabeth Taylor's weddings and one of her film sets, in that narrow window of time when the most famous woman in the world was also trying to be a mother. In the photo, she is laughing. Her dark violet eyes are catching the light, her black hair is perfectly set, and around her are 4 children who are looking at her the way children always look at someone they love but cannot quite reach. Not with anger, not with resentment. With something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. With a kind of longing that only makes sense when you understand the life that surrounded them. Elizabeth Taylor was the most photographed, most talked about, most desired woman of the 20th century. She collected diamonds the way other women collected memories. She married 8 times. She made movies that made the world stop. She was larger than life in every possible sense of that phrase. But behind every flashbulb, behind every headline, behind every extravagant gesture and passionate declaration, there were 4 children growing up in the eye of a storm they never asked to be born into. Michael, Christopher, Liza, Maria, 4 names that almost never appear in the same sentence as their mothers. 4 lives that unfolded in the shadows of one of the most blazing spotlights in human history. And when you look closely at what happened to each of them, the picture that emerges is not the one the tabloids painted. It is something stranger, more painful, and in some ways more extraordinary than anything Elizabeth Taylor ever put on screen. This is not a story about glamour. This is a story about inheritance. Not of diamonds or film contracts or famous last names, but of something far more complicated. The kind of inheritance that does not come in a will. The kind that lives in the body, in the nervous system, in the patterns of love and loss that get handed down whether anyone wants them or not. Before we go any further into this story, if you find yourself moved by tales of extraordinary lives and the complicated truths that live beneath the surface of fame, consider subscribing. This channel exists for people who want to understand not just what happened, but why it mattered. Stories like this one take time and care to tell properly. Stay with us. Now, to understand the children, you first have to understand the mother. Not the icon, not the legend, the woman. Elizabeth Rosamond Taylor was born in London in 1932 to American parents who had relocated to England before the war. Her father, Francis, was an art dealer. Her mother, Sarah, was a former actress who had given up the stage but never quite given up the idea of the stage. That distinction matters. Sarah Taylor was one of those women whose unfulfilled ambitions found their fullest expression in their children. And from the moment it became clear that little Elizabeth had something extraordinary, something almost supernaturally magnetic about her, Sarah redirected her entire life toward cultivating it. Elizabeth's childhood was not unhappy in the conventional sense. She was not neglected or abused. She was, in fact, lavished with attention, but the attention was always in service of something. Her beauty was a resource, her talent was a commodity. By the time she was 10 years old, she had signed with MGM. By the time she was 12, she had filmed National Velvet and become a star. By the time she was 18, she had already learned something that would shape the rest of her life, that the world responded to her most powerfully when she performed, and that the performance was always expected. This is important because Elizabeth Taylor's children did not grow up with a mother who had quietly resolved her own inner life before deciding to have a family. They grew up with a woman who was still working out the most fundamental questions of her identity in public, at full volume, with the entire world watching. That is not a criticism, it is a context. Because you cannot understand what happened to Michael, Christopher, Liisa and Maria without understanding the particular kind of chaos they were born into. Her first husband was Conrad Nicholson Hilton Jr., the son of the hotel magnate. She was 18, he was 23. The marriage lasted 8 months and, by most accounts, was a disaster from almost the first week. Nicky Hilton was charming in public and volatile in private, prone to drinking and gambling and cruelty, in ways that the wide-eyed teenager who had grown up on MGM soundstages was completely unprepared for. There were no children from this marriage, but there was damage. The kind of damage that a young woman carries into her next relationship, and the one after that, reshaping what she believes she deserves and what she thinks love is supposed to feel like. The second husband was Michael Wilding, a British actor who was 20 years her senior. He was gentle where Nicky had been cruel, he was steady where Nicky had been volatile. He was also in the way of men who are chosen partly as antidotes to the previous man, not quite what Elizabeth had imagined he would be once the relief of not being hurt wore off. But Michael Wilding gave her something that no one else had yet. He gave her a family. Michael Howard Wilding was born on January 6, 1953. He was Elizabeth Taylor's first child, and from the moment he arrived, he occupied a place in her heart that was real and fierce and complicated. Elizabeth had wanted a baby with an intensity that surprised people around her. Here was a woman who could have anything the world offered, and what she wanted, at least in that moment, was this: a small face, a weight in her arms. Something that was hers in a way that movie roles and magazine covers were not. Christopher Edward Wilding followed on February 27, 1955. 2 boys, 2 years apart, born to one of the most famous couples in Hollywood at a time when Hollywood was still the center of the universe. Their early years had a texture that mixed the surreal with the surprisingly ordinary. They lived in a house in Beverly Hills. They had nurses and nannies. They went to birthday parties where their classmates' parents were also movie stars, but there were also quieter moments, Elizabeth reading to them, playing with them in the garden, trying in her imperfect and passionate way to be present. The marriage to Michael Wilding was dissolving, however, not dramatically, not with the fire and fury that would characterize her later separations, but slowly, like something left out in the rain. By 1956, they had separated. By 1957, the divorce was final. And Elizabeth, who could not bear to be alone, who experienced solitude the way some people experience physical pain, had already met the man who would change everything. Mike Todd was a theatrical producer, a showman, a man of enormous energy and self-invention. He was not conventionally handsome, he was not young, he was not gentle. But he was alive in a way that made everyone around him feel more alive. And Elizabeth Taylor, who had spent years beside a man whose steadiness had curdled into something close to inertia, was utterly undone by him. They were married in February 1957. Their daughter, Elizabeth Frances Todd, was born on August 6, 1957, and called Liza from the beginning. For a brief, incandescent period, this was the happiest Elizabeth had ever been. Mike Todd adored her with a largeness and a loudness that matched her own. He gave her the famous diamond. He threw her parties. He told the world constantly and extravagantly that she was the greatest woman who had ever lived. And she believed him, why wouldn't she? He was the first person who seemed to love not just the beauty or the talent or the star, but the wild, difficult, emotional creature underneath all of that. Then, on March 22, 1958, the private plane carrying Mike Todd crashed in New Mexico. He was the only passenger. He died instantly. Elizabeth was not on board. She had a bad cold and had stayed home. She was 26 years old, with 3 children and a husband suddenly and violently gone, and the grief that descended on her was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It was not the gradual fading of a failing marriage. It was an amputation. What happened in the immediate aftermath of Mike Todd's death is one of the most analyzed and debated chapters of Elizabeth Taylor's biography. Within weeks, she had turned to Eddie Fisher, her late husband's best friend. Eddie Fisher was married to Debbie Reynolds, one of the most beloved actresses in America. The affair, when it became public, was a scandal of almost unimaginable proportions by the standards of the late 1950s. Elizabeth Taylor went from being the grieving widow the world wanted to comfort to being the home-wrecking villain the world wanted to punish. The shift happened overnight, and she married Eddie Fisher in 1959, less than a year after Mike Todd's death. This matters for the children's story because it was during this period of grief and scandal and rapid remarriage, that Michael, Christopher, and Liisa experienced some of the most destabilizing years of their early lives. They were old enough to feel the turbulence but not old enough to understand it. The house was full of new people, new tensions, new configurations. Their mother was simultaneously mourning and building a new life, and those two things do not sit together easily in a household with young children. Then came Cleopatra, and then came Richard Burton. And then everything changed again, in ways that none of them, not Elizabeth, not the children, not Richard, could have possibly anticipated. The filming of Cleopatra began in 1961 and was, from the start, a catastrophe of almost mythological proportions. The budget exploded. The original director was replaced. Elizabeth became seriously ill and nearly died. And then she fell in love with Richard Burton on the set in Rome. and the story stopped being about a movie and became something else entirely. Richard Burton was, by most accounts, one of the most talented actors of his generation. He had a voice that could make Shakespeare sound like gossip and gossip sound like Shakespeare. He was Welsh, working class in origin, brilliant, self-destructive, funny, cruel, tender, and impossible. He was also married, as was Elizabeth, and the affair that developed between them became the defining media obsession of the early 1960s in a way that is almost impossible to fully convey now. There were helicopter photographers, there were protests, the Vatican issued an official condemnation. The word Liz and Dick entered the language as its own kind of shorthand for passion, so excessive it became its own spectacle. Elizabeth and Eddie Fisher divorced. Elizabeth and Richard Burton married in March 1964. And into this new configuration came a fourth child, one who arrived not by birth, but by a decision Elizabeth made that tells you something essential about the kind of love she was capable of when it did not have to compete with her own survival. In 1961, before the Burton affair began, Elizabeth Taylor had been in Munich for the filming of Judgment at Nuremberg. While there, she and Eddie Fisher had become aware of a German child living in an orphanage. The child's name was Maria, and she had been born with severe hip dysplasia and other medical complications that had made her difficult to place for adoption. She was not, by the calculations of prospective parents looking for the easiest path, an appealing choice. Elizabeth chose her anyway. The adoption was finalized in 1964, and Maria became Maria Burton when Richard formally adopted her. She was given the name Maria Burton, and she entered a family that was, by that point, one of the most watched and most chaotic households in the world. 4 children. 4 completely different origins, 4 different sets of vulnerabilities and needs, and a mother who loved them all genuinely and fiercely, but whose capacity to be consistently present for them was in constant competition with the force of her own life. This is the architecture of the story. Now let us look at what was built within it. Michael Wilding Jr. was the eldest, and in many families, the eldest child of a volatile parent becomes a particular kind of person. They learn to read the room early. They develop a sensitivity to emotional weather that can be both a gift and a burden. They often become the ones who try to hold things together, or who learn very early that things cannot be held together, and quietly remove themselves from the effort. Michael's childhood was, in its external circumstances, extraordinary. He grew up in a world of absolute material privilege. There were the houses in Beverly Hills, the villas in Europe, the yachts, the collections of art and jewels that his mother treated almost like living things, each one with its own story and emotional weight. He met heads of state. He spent summers in places that most people only see in magazines, but the interior landscape of his childhood was considerably less stable. His parents' marriage dissolved when he was 3. His mother's grief over Mike Todd arrived when he was 5. The Eddie Fisher years brought a new stepfather, and then, within a few years, another departure. By the time Richard Burton entered the picture, Michael had already lived through more emotional upheaval than most adults experience in a lifetime, and he was 8 years old. Richard Burton was not a natural stepfather. He was not the warm, engaged, domestically comfortable kind of man who intuitively knows how to make children feel safe and seen. He was brilliant and magnetic and capable of genuine tenderness. But he was also an alcoholic whose moods could swing with terrifying speed from warmth to darkness, and he lived in a state of constant creative and emotional intensity that left little room in the atmosphere for the quieter needs of children. He and Elizabeth fed each other's excesses. They fought spectacularly, they loved spectacularly, and they did both of these things in front of, around, and sometimes directly involving their children. Michael's response to all of this was, in many ways, a retreat into himself. He was not a difficult child in the way that might attract attention and intervention. He was quieter than that. He was thoughtful and observant, the kind of child who watches more than he speaks and stores more than he shows. He was enrolled in schools in England and Switzerland, partly for the quality of the education and partly because the peripatetic nature of his parents' life meant that the children were always being moved, always adjusting to new countries, new classmates, new configurations of the household. What Michael found as he moved into adolescence was film, not acting initially but filmmaking, the camera as a way of observing the world rather than being observed by it. This distinction feels significant when you consider where he came from. He had grown up as an object of the camera's attention, photographed from birth simply because of whose son he was. To stand behind the camera rather than in front of it was, perhaps, a way of reclaiming some control over how the world was seen and experienced. He studied film, he worked as a production assistant, he built a career in the industry that had, in a sense, consumed his childhood, but on his own terms and in his own corner of it. He did not seek fame. He did not leverage his mother's connections in the obvious ways. He was, by the accounts of people who worked with him, genuinely talented and genuinely committed to the craft. But the patterns of his upbringing did not simply evaporate because he had found a meaningful vocation. The emotional turbulence of his early years had left its marks in the way that early turbulence always does. He struggled at various points in his adult life with the kinds of difficulties that are not uncommon in children who grew up in households where love was intense but consistency was scarce. The navigation of intimacy, the management of his own internal weather. The question of what stability even looks like when you have never quite seen it modeled. He married Johanna Lichtenberg, a woman who was, by all accounts, steady and grounded in the ways that he needed. They built a life together in England, away from the most intense glare of the Taylor legacy. They had children of their own, making Elizabeth Taylor a grandmother in ways that she embraced with what friends described as genuine, uncomplicated joy. There is something poignant about the fact that Michael, the child who had experienced the most turbulent version of his mother's early motherhood, was also the one who seemed to most directly understand what she had been trying to give her children, even when she couldn't quite deliver it. He spoke about her in later interviews with a kind of compassionate clarity that took years to develop. He understood that she had loved him. He also understood that loving someone and being available to them are not always the same thing, and that understanding the difference was one of the most important pieces of work he had done in his adult life. Christopher Wilding, the second son, took a somewhat different path, though the outlines of his journey rhyme in interesting ways with his brothers. Christopher was, from early on, more openly expressive than Michael. Where Michael retreated, Christopher engaged. Where Michael found the camera as a shield, Christopher found human connection as his medium. He was warmer on the surface, more comfortable in social settings, though the warmth, as people who knew him well understood, was built on the same complicated foundation as his brother's quietness. Christopher also went into the film industry, eventually working as an editor. Film editing is one of the most invisible crafts in cinema. It is the work of shaping a story from the inside, of deciding what stays and what goes, of finding the emotional rhythm of a scene that the director and actors have created. It requires deep sensitivity and a kind of patience that is not immediately obvious. It is also, in its own way, a form of control over narrative. You take the raw material of experience and you decide what it means by deciding what it shows. Whether Christopher consciously experienced his professional choice in these terms is unknowable. But there is something resonant about the idea that both of the Wilding boys, raised in one of the most publicly narrated lives in human history, both gravitated toward telling stories from behind the scenes. Christopher married and had children. His personal life was, in the grand Taylor scheme, relatively quiet, which is perhaps the highest compliment you can pay to someone who grew up in those particular circumstances. He maintained a relationship with his mother that was warm, if also periodically complicated by the sheer force of her personality and the way that her world always seemed to organize itself around her gravitational pull. Elizabeth Taylor was not, by most accounts, someone who made it easy to be just a person in her presence. Even in private, even with her children, she carried the weight of being Elizabeth Taylor. There were always assistants and doctors and friends and journalists hovering at the edges. There was always a diamond that needed to be discussed or a health crisis that needed to be managed or a relationship that was exploding or igniting. The ordinary texture of family life, the sitting at the kitchen table, the driving to school, the watching television together without anything dramatic happening, was genuinely difficult to achieve around her. Christopher navigated this with what seems, from the outside, like a combination of love and realistic expectation. He knew who his mother was, he knew what he could and could not ask of her, and he built his own life in the space that understanding created. Liza Todd Burton's story is, in some ways, the most interesting of the four, and also the one that requires the most careful telling. She was born into the brief, brilliant happiness of the Mike Todd years, which means she was born into something that immediately became a loss. She was 7 months old when her father died. She had no memories of him. She was raised, for most of her formative years, in the orbit of a mother who was both deeply loving and perpetually in the grip of something enormous, whether that was grief or a new marriage or a film or a scandal or an illness. Liisa was, by the descriptions of people who knew her, a child with her mother's emotional intensity. Not her mother's beauty, particularly, though she was striking in her own way, but that quality of feeling things fully and showing that she felt them. She was not a child who learned to hide her emotional weather the way Michael did. She was expressive and passionate, and, in the way of children who take after a parent who is also expressive and passionate, she sometimes found herself in direct collision with her mother rather than simply in her shadow. The relationship between Elizabeth and Liisa was, over the years, one of the most emotionally charged dynamics in the family. It was also, in some ways, the closest. There is a particular quality to the relationship between a mother and a daughter when both are women of strong feeling, when both are capable of enormous love and enormous conflict, when neither of them has learned to be small or quiet or manageable. It can be the most profound connection in the world. It can also be the most explosive. Liisa did not go into film. She went into art, specifically sculpture. She became a sculptor of real and recognized talent, working in a medium that is tactile and physical and three-dimensional, that requires you to put your hands on the material and shape it directly. There is no lens between you and the object. There is no editing afterward. You make the thing and the thing is what it is. She married Hap Tivey, a sculptor and artist himself, and they built a life together in which the shared language of creative work was also the shared language of their partnership. They had a son named Quinn. And Liisa became, over time, someone whose identity was rooted in something entirely her own, not in the Taylor name or the Burton name or any of the complicated inheritances of her parents' world, but in the work she made with her own hands. But the work of separating herself from the weight of that inheritance was not simple or linear. Liisa was the child who had been most directly shaped by the Mike Todd absence, by growing up with a grief she had not experienced, but that saturated the atmosphere of her earliest years. She was also the child who had been most present during the Elizabeth and Richard years, old enough to feel their turbulence and young enough to be unable to contextualize it. The alcoholism that Richard Burton brought into the household was not a hidden thing. It was, in the way of advanced alcoholism, omnipresent in its effects even when the alcohol itself was not visible. It changed the texture of the air. It made the emotional temperature of any room unpredictable. And it interacted with Elizabeth's own complicated relationship with substances in ways that created an environment that was, whatever its warmth and richness and love, also genuinely hard. Elizabeth Taylor's battles with prescription drug dependency and alcohol are well documented and have been told from many angles. What is less often discussed is what those battles looked like from inside the house, from the perspective of 4 children who loved their mother and also could not control what was happening to her. There is a particular helplessness that children feel when a parent's illness is one that resists love as a cure. You can love someone with everything you have, and it is not enough, and learning that lesson early in the most intimate possible context leaves marks that last. This is not to say that the children's lives were defined by damage. They were not. Each of them built lives that contained joy and meaning and genuine achievement, but the scars were real, and honest telling of their stories requires acknowledging them. Maria Burton's story begins in a place of almost incomprehensible difficulty and becomes, in its own way, one of the most remarkable of the 4. She was born in 1961 in Germany. Her birth name is not fully known publicly. She had significant physical challenges from birth, hip dysplasia, and other complications that required extensive medical intervention. She spent the earliest years of her life in an orphanage, waiting, not chosen, not taken home. Just waiting, in the particular limbo that is the experience of a child in institutional care, who has enough awareness to understand her situation but not enough power to change it. When Elizabeth Taylor chose her, it was not the obvious choice. It was not the choice of a woman looking for the easiest path to parenthood. It was the choice of a woman who saw a child who needed her, and responded to that need with the same full-force emotional commitment she brought to everything else in her life. Elizabeth fought for the adoption. There were bureaucratic obstacles and legal complications, and she navigated all of them with the same stubborn determination she brought to the diamonds and the films and the men she wanted. Maria grew up as Elizabeth Taylor's daughter and Richard Burton's adopted daughter, which means she grew up inside the full spectacle of the Liz and Dick phenomenon. She was different from the other children in ways that were visible, at least initially, because her early medical history had left physical traces. She walked differently, she looked different from her siblings, and in the world of absolute public scrutiny that the Taylor-Burton family inhabited, difference was never invisible. What Elizabeth did for Maria, in the face of this visibility, was something that people who were around the family consistently describe as one of her most genuinely admirable qualities. She did not minimize Maria's differences or try to hide them. She also did not make them the defining story. She simply loved Maria with the same lavish, impractical, overwhelming love she brought to everything. She dressed her beautifully. She included her in everything. She made it clear in every way she could that Maria was hers completely and without qualification. Maria needed multiple surgeries over the course of her childhood, and Elizabeth was present for all of them in a way that even people who were critical of her parenting in other areas consistently acknowledge. When her child was medically vulnerable, Elizabeth Taylor showed up. There was something in the caregiving mode, in the active, urgent business of being needed, that brought out the most focused and reliable version of her. As Maria grew into adulthood, she navigated the complicated question of identity that is universal among adopted children, but that was amplified in her case by the particular circumstances of her adoption and the particular family she had joined. She was German by birth and American by adoption. She was a Burton by name and a Taylor by experience. She was a woman whose earliest life had been defined by institutional care, and whose later life had been defined by one of the most extraordinary households in the world. The distance between those two realities was not something that resolved itself neatly. Maria married in 1981. She had children. She built a life that was, by the standards of the family she came from, quieter and more private. She stayed close to her mother in ways that were, again, complicated by the force of Elizabeth's personality, but also sustained by the genuine bond between them. There is something in Maria's story about the power of a chosen connection, about the fact that Elizabeth's love for her was not the automatic love of biology, but a deliberate, decided love, and that this deliberateness had a particular weight and meaning. When Elizabeth Taylor began her very public decline, Maria was one of the family members most consistently present. The health crises multiplied in the 1990s and 2000s. Elizabeth had battled hip problems, back problems, pneumonia, a brain tumor. She had been to rehab. She had come out of rehab. She had reinvented herself as an AIDS activist with a passion and a visibility that genuinely changed the trajectory of the epidemic's cultural visibility. She had remained, even in diminishment, unmistakably herself. And through all of it, her children, all four of them, were navigating the experience of watching a force of nature become mortal. The AIDS activism deserves more than a passing mention in this story, because it reveals something about Elizabeth Taylor's character that is genuinely important, and that connects directly to the story of her children. When HIV and AIDS emerged in the early 1980s as a catastrophic and stigmatized epidemic, many of the people dying were Elizabeth's friends and colleagues from the entertainment world. Gay men, artists, actors, designers, people she had loved, people the world had decided to let die in silence and shame. Elizabeth Taylor did not let that stand. She helped found the American Foundation for AIDS Research. She lobbied Congress. She raised hundreds of millions of dollars. She used her fame, that enormous and often exhausting thing that had shaped her entire life, as a tool for something that mattered enormously. She was doing this at a time when it was genuinely costly to be associated with the epidemic, when powerful people were actively distancing themselves. She moved toward it. Her children watched this. They watched their mother's fame, which had so often felt like a competing force in their family, become something that saved lives. The same quality in her that had made her difficult to live with, the insistence on doing everything at full volume, on bringing her entire self to whatever she was engaged in, was exactly the quality that made her advocacy so effective. You cannot look away from Elizabeth Taylor. And when Elizabeth Taylor wants you to look at something, you look at it. This is part of what made the inheritance complicated. Their mother's most difficult quality was also her most important one. Her insistence on her own immensity was simultaneously the thing that had made their childhoods unpredictable, and the thing that had, in the end, done real good in the world. How do you make sense of that? How do you organize your feelings about a parent who was both genuinely difficult and genuinely extraordinary? You grow up, and you figure it out, not all at once and not without help and not without grief, but you figure it out. Let us go back and look more closely at the specific turning points in each child's life, because the broad strokes are one thing and the specifics are another, and the specifics are where the story lives. Michael Wilding, Jr. His adult life included a period in the 1970s and early 1980s that was genuinely turbulent. He was, by his own acknowledgement in later years, working through the accumulated emotional weight of his childhood in ways that were not always healthy or constructive. He struggled with some of the same patterns of excess that had characterized his parents' world, though he was, by temperament, more self-aware about them than either of them had been. He had the advantage of perspective that his parents never quite achieved, because perspective requires some distance, and they were always too close to their own lives to see them clearly. His marriage, when it came, provided a kind of grounding that people who knew him describe as transformative. Johanna was not from the world he had grown up in. She brought a different set of expectations and a different quality of attention, and Michael, who had spent his childhood in a household where attention was abundant but often misdirected, responded to her steady focus with something like relief. They had children and made a life, and he found, if not the simple, uncomplicated peace that had always eluded his family of origin, something close enough to it to be sustaining. He stayed involved in film, working as a producer on various projects over the years. He was not famous. He did not appear to want to be famous. He appeared to want, above all, to be useful and present in his own life in a way that his childhood had not always modeled. There is dignity in that choice, and also a kind of quiet grief in it, because you can hear in it the shape of what he had wished for and not always had. Christopher Wilding's path through adulthood had its own texture. He was more socially adventurous than his brother, more willing to inhabit the world of his mother's fame without being consumed by it. He could work a room in a way that Michael could not. He had something of his mother's warmth and extroversion, though without the particular megawatt quality that made her impossible to ignore. He was likable in an approachable way rather than in an overwhelming way. His film editing career was genuinely his own, built on talent and persistence rather than the family name. Editors are chosen for their skill and their temperament, for their ability to sit with footage and find the story within it, and Christopher had both. He worked on a variety of projects and built professional relationships that were based on what he could do, not who he was related to. His personal life included relationships and, eventually, children. He was a father who was, by the accounts available, attentive in the ways that his own upbringing had not always been. The pattern that appears in the stories of all four of Elizabeth's children is this. Each of them, in their own way, made a conscious decision to be different kinds of parents than they had experienced. This is not a judgment of Elizabeth. It is simply a recognition that children often parent in response to their own childhood, and when the childhood was characterized by intensity and instability, the response frequently moves in the direction of calm and consistency. Liza Todd Burton's adult life was shaped most visibly by her art. Sculpture is a demanding discipline. It requires physical strength and spatial intelligence and an unusual tolerance for failure, because stone and metal do not forgive mistakes the way a canvas does. You cannot paint over what you have done. You have to work with the consequences of your choices. There is something almost philosophically apt about the fact that the daughter of Elizabeth Taylor, who lived her life in the most public and irreversible of ways, chose a medium that punished the impulse to undo. Lisa's sculptures are described by critics as emotionally resonant and technically accomplished, which is both a professional compliment and a personal revelation. She had found a way to put the emotional intensity of her inheritance, that Taylor-level feeling, into a form that could hold it. That was no small thing. Her marriage to Hap Tivey was, by all accounts, a genuine partnership of equals. They shared a creative life and a domestic life, And the combination seems to have given Liisa the thing that had been most absent from her childhood: stability that did not require sacrifice of intensity. A world in which feeling things deeply was a professional asset rather than a domestic problem. She spoke about her mother in interviews over the years with a combination of love and complexity that was clearly genuine. She was not, in the way of some celebrity children, interested in converting her complicated feelings into a simple narrative, whether protective or critical. She seemed to have done real internal work about what it had meant to grow up in that household, and the work had produced in her something that looked very much like earned clarity. Maria Burton's adult life involved the particular task of integrating identities that were, on the surface, radically discontinuous. She was the only one of the 4 children who had to hold together a before and an after. Before Elizabeth, there was an institutional childhood in Germany that she did not fully remember, but that had shaped her body and her earliest sense of the world. After Elizabeth, there was everything that Elizabeth brought: the grandeur and the chaos and the love. She took her mother's name in various configurations over the years. She had a son. She remained, by the accounts of family friends, one of the children most consistently connected to Elizabeth in her later years. There was something in the nature of their bond, the explicit chosenness of it, that seemed to make Maria more able to be present for the relationship's difficulties without being destroyed by them. She had never been able to take Elizabeth's love for granted, because it had not been automatic. She had known on some level that it was a decision, and that knowledge seems to have made her more rather than less secure in it. The 1990s brought a reconfiguration for all 4 children because they brought the public decline of one of the most significant figures in their lives. Not Elizabeth, not yet. But Richard Burton, who had been a defining presence in all of their lives despite being the biological father of none of them, died in August 1984. He was 58 years old. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage in Switzerland. Elizabeth was not with him when he died. They had divorced, remarried, and divorced again, and he had been married to someone else for years by the time of his death. But the loss undid her in ways that she never entirely recovered from. For the children, Richard Burton's death was complicated in the particular way that the death of a complicated figure always is. He had been, for most of their formative years, a kind of second son in their household, enormous and brilliant and hot. He had loved Elizabeth with a ferocity that was both inspiring and terrifying. He had been kind to them in moments and absent in others. He had been struggling with alcoholism through much of the most critical period of their childhood, and alcoholism in a parent, even a step-parent, shapes the children in the household in ways that last long after the person is gone. The grief of his death mixed with the relief of his death in the way that grief often does when the person who has died had been both loved and hard to live with. The children did not talk extensively about this publicly, which is perhaps the wisest possible response. Some things are not meant for public processing. Elizabeth herself, after Richard's death, entered one of the most turbulent periods of her adult life. Her substance use escalated, her health deteriorated. She checked herself into the Betty Ford Center in 1983 and then again in 1988. The second time was at the urging of her children, who staged an intervention that was, by accounts from family and close friends, one of the most painful and also one of the most important things they ever did as a family. Think about what it means to intervene on a parent, to gather yourselves together and say, collectively and formally, that the person who was supposed to take care of you needs to be taken care of, that the roles have reversed. That you love her enough to do the frightening thing, that you will not look away. Michael, Christopher, Liza, and Maria all participated in this. 4 very different people with 4 very different relationships to their mother, and to the chaos of their shared upbringing, united in the same room doing the same difficult thing. There is something deeply moving about it when you understand everything that preceded it. They could have walked away. They could have protected themselves by maintaining the distance that many children of difficult parents eventually find necessary. They did not walk away. They walked toward her instead. Elizabeth went to the Betty Ford Center. She got sober, at least for a period, in ways that were genuinely sustained, and that she later described as among the most important achievements of her life. The children's intervention had worked. Or at least it had opened a door that Elizabeth, ultimately, had to choose to walk through herself. The sobriety enabled a different kind of relationship between Elizabeth and her children in the late 1980s and into the 1990s. It did not make the relationship simple or uncomplicated. Elizabeth Taylor was constitutionally incapable of simple or uncomplicated, but it made them more honest. It made her more present in a way that each of the children responded to differently, but that all of them, in various ways, valued. She threw herself into the AIDS work during this period, with an energy and a focus that her children watched with something that seems to have been genuine admiration. Here was their mother, aging and physically fragile, and still carrying all the weight of everything she had been and done, fighting for something that had nothing to do with her own survival. Fighting because people were dying and the world was not sufficiently enraged about it. It was, in its way, her greatest performance, and it was not a performance at all. The 1990s brought the inevitable physical decline that comes for everyone, but that arrived for Elizabeth Taylor with particular complexity, given the years of medical crises and substance use that had preceded it. She had a brain tumor removed in 1997, she had hip replacement surgery, she dealt with congestive heart failure. Each crisis was covered with the same media intensity that had followed every other moment of her life, which meant that her children experienced their mother's decline, in the strange context of also watching the world watch their mother's decline. There is something uniquely invasive about that experience. Most people lose a parent privately. The grief belongs to the family. The process belongs to the family. When your parent is Elizabeth Taylor, none of it belongs to the family. It belongs, at least partially, to the world. And the world does not always handle the dying of its icons with grace. Michael, Christopher, Liza, and Maria navigated the later years of Elizabeth's life in the ways that adult children always navigate a parent's decline, with varying degrees of presence and distance. With arguments about care and disagreements about decisions with love that did not always manifest as the other person needed it to in that particular moment. The specific details of this period are appropriately private. But the shape of it is universal, even when the person at the center of it is not. Elizabeth Roseman Taylor died on March 23, 2011. She was 79 years old. The cause was congestive heart failure. She died at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, surrounded by family. The news traveled around the world within minutes. Social media, which she had only barely encountered, carried the announcement. Tributes poured in from presidents and ordinary people and every category of person in between. The headlines used words like icon and legend and irreplaceable, all of which were true and none of which were sufficient. Because what Elizabeth Taylor had been, before she was any of those things, was a person. And the people who understood that most completely, the people for whom she had been most fully and most problematically a person, were the four adults who gathered around her in those final hours. Michael was 68 years old when his mother died. Christopher was 56. Liza was 53. Maria was 49. They were not children anymore. They had lived their own long, complicated lives. They had married and divorced and raised children and made work and struggled and recovered and found meaning. And yet, in the fact of losing her, something happened to each of them that no amount of adult emotional sophistication can entirely prepare you for. You lose a parent and you lose the witness. You lose the person who was there at the beginning. You lose the particular relationship that no one else in the world had with that specific version of you. Even when the relationship was complicated, even when it was painful, even when you spent years and money and therapy sessions working out exactly how complicated and how painful it was, the loss is real. It opens a space that cannot be filled by anything else. The estate that Elizabeth left behind was, in purely financial terms, substantial. She had been a savvy businesswoman in the later decades of her life, particularly with her Elizabeth Taylor fragrance line, which became one of the most successful celebrity fragrance enterprises in history. White diamonds alone made her more money than most of her films ever had. She left assets of considerable value, and they were distributed according to her wishes, which included bequests to her children and grandchildren, but also significant gifts to the AIDS charities she had spent the last 20 years of her life supporting. The diamonds, of course, were famous. The Krupp diamond, the Taylor Burton diamond, the La Peregrina pearl. Each of them carried a story that was also Elizabeth's story, because she had chosen each of them with the same deliberateness she brought to everything she chose. Each of them was sold at auction, and together they brought millions of dollars that went partially to fund AIDS research. Even in death, she was using what she had accumulated to do something that mattered. It was, in its way, perfect. For the children, the aftermath of her death involved the ordinary, extraordinary work of settling an estate that was not ordinary in any particular. There were the possessions, which were numerous and valuable, and each of which carried memory. There were the practical decisions that death requires, the ones that have nothing to do with grief and yet must be made in the middle of it. And there was the larger, less manageable work of figuring out who they were now that the gravitational center of their family was gone. All four of them are still alive as of the telling of this story. Michael continues to live in England, out of the public eye, in the life he spent decades carefully constructing. Christopher maintains the same quality of relative privacy, though he is occasionally visible at events connected to his mother's legacy. Liisa continues to make her sculptures, continues to be a person whose identity is rooted most fully in her own creative work rather than her family's history. And Maria, who began this story in an orphanage in Germany and ended it as the daughter of one of the most famous women who ever lived, continues to carry the weight and the wonder of that particular journey. There are grandchildren now. Elizabeth Taylor's grandchildren are growing up in a world where their grandmother is history rather than present, where she is something you read about in books and watch in old films, and find in documentaries like this one rather than something you feel in the room with you. They will inherit a different kind of legacy than their parents did, a legacy already mediated by time and mythology. For Michael's children and Christopher's children and Lisa's son Quinn, Elizabeth Taylor will always be something that requires explanation and context. She will never simply be grandmother. She will be Elizabeth Taylor and also grandmother, which is a strange and specific inheritance to carry. What does it mean, finally, to be the child of someone that immense? To be born into a story that is already too large for any one person, already carrying too much history and too much attention and too much feeling. To grow up understanding that your mother was loved by millions of people who never met her, while also knowing the very specific ways in which being loved by her felt like, and did not feel like what you needed. Each of Elizabeth Taylor's 4 children answered this question differently, and each of their answers is its own kind of wisdom. Michael answered it by building a life that was scaled to human proportions, that prioritized the small, consistent, manageable forms of love over the grand and overwhelming kind. He answered it by becoming the kind of parent who shows up in the ordinary moments, because he understood from the inside what the absence of ordinary moments costs. Christopher answered it by staying connected to the world his mother had inhabited, the world of film and creativity, but from behind the scenes rather than in front of them. He found a way to be in relationship with that world without being consumed by it. Liisa answered it by making things, by putting her hands on material that resisted her and shaping it anyway, by making art that contained her feeling without performing it. By choosing in her personal life the kind of partnership that is built on mutuality rather than on one person's orbit pulling everything else into its gravity. Maria answered it by being chosen. By knowing in the most fundamental possible way that love is not only biological or automatic, that it can be a decision, and that a decided love, a love that someone has chosen in full knowledge of the cost and the difficulty, is not lesser than any other kind. It may even be greater. Elizabeth Taylor's legacy is often told in carats and box office returns, and the number of times she was married and the depth of her violet eyes. But the truest measure of any life is not what it accumulated, it is what it made. And what Elizabeth Taylor made, however imperfectly, however incidentally, however amid the spectacular noise of being herself, was 4 human beings who grew into people of real substance and genuine resilience. She gave them a world that was often too large and too bright and too loud. She gave them a childhood that was extravagant in some dimensions and depleted in others. She gave them a name that opened doors and complicated every room they entered. She gave them her love, which was real, even when it was intermittent, even when it was misdirected. Even when it was competing with everything else she was trying to love at the same time. And they took all of that, all the diamonds and the chaos and the famous face and the complicated absences and the intervention in a living room and the final hours in a hospital in Los Angeles, and they built lives from it. Quiet lives, imperfect lives, human-sized lives. There is that photograph again, Elizabeth laughing, the four children looking at her with that complicated, particular longing. You look at it now and you know what happened next to each of them, and the photograph becomes something different than it first appeared. It is not, as it might seem, a picture of people who will be diminished by what comes next. It is a picture of people who will, in their separate and unspectacular ways, be equal to it. That is the story that almost no one tells about Elizabeth Taylor. Not the one about the diamonds or the marriages or the films. The one about the four children who grew up in the eye of the storm and found, each in their own time and their own way, ground to stand on. Some inheritances cannot be measured. Some legacies live not in what people said about you after you were gone, but in how the people who loved you most and were most loved by you managed to love the world in return.